My grandfather left me his house on one condition. I had to spend 1 week there every summer, and I was never under any circumstances to go swimming in the reservoir after dark, because the old town at the bottom, he claimed, sometimes rises. The house was a rustic, isolated cabin perched on a hill overlooking the vast, glassy expanse of the Millers Creek Reservoir in rural Tennessee. It had been his sanctuary, his escape from the world. When he passed, the lawyer handed me the keys along with a bizarre, handwritten codicil to his will. I'd laughed it off. Gramps had always been a storyteller, his mind a tapestry of Appalachian folklore and ghost stories. A rising, drowned town seemed exactly like one of his campfire tales. For me, a software engineer from the concrete maze of Boston, the inheritance was a welcome, if strange, gift, a guaranteed week of unplugged silence each year. The first few summers, I obeyed the rule out of a sort of nostalgic respect. The reservoir itself was beautiful but held a certain melancholy. I knew the history. In the 1950s, the valley had been deliberately flooded by the state to create the reservoir, submerging the small, Depression-era town of Havenwood. Whole houses, a church, a main street, all of it sacrificed for progress, and now slumbering under 100 feet of cold, dark water. The thought was haunting enough in broad daylight. By my fourth summer, however, the novelty had worn off and the Boston heatwave had followed me south. The week was suffocatingly hot and humid. The cabin's ancient air conditioner wheezed and rattled, but did little to combat the oppressive stillness. Each evening, I would sit on the porch, nursing a beer, watching the sun bleed out behind the mountains, and stare at the cool, inviting surface of the water. The old warning felt less like a supernatural threat and more like a cruel joke. That's when I began to notice the small things. During the day, I'd find strange objects washed up on the rocky shoreline below the cabin. Not the usual driftwood and plastic bottles, but things that felt out of time. A small, waterlogged wooden horse with his paint flaked off. A glass milk bottle with the faded logo of Havenwood Dairy. A single, perfectly preserved child's leather shoe. I told myself they were just old pieces of debris, finally shaken loose from the silt by the currents. Yet they seemed to be appearing more frequently this year. The sound started on the third night. Lying in bed, with the windows open to catch a non-existent breeze, I heard a faint, muffled sound drifting across the water. At first, I thought it was a distant boat engine, but it was more rhythmic, more melodic. It sounded impossibly like a church bell, a single solemn dong, 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 echoing from the deep. I sat bolt upright, straining to hear, but it was gone, replaced by the chirping of crickets. The next night, it was different. It was music, faint, tinny piano music, like something from an old-timey saloon, a cheerful, ghostly tune that made the hair on my arms stand up. Each evening, I began to observe the water level. I marked a spot on one of the large shoreline rocks. After sunset, the water would recede, not by an inch or two, but by a foot, sometimes more, exposing a dark, muddy ring around the shore, only to be back to its normal level by sunrise. The local news mentioned nothing of the TVA opening the dam downstream. The water was simply draining away into the night. On the fifth night, the heat was unbearable. The air was thick and heavy, and the cabin felt like an oven. The reservoir, shimmering under a full moon, looked like a sheet of cool, dark silk. Gramps' warning felt like a distant, faded memory. The ghost stories felt like foolishness in the face of the oppressive, physical reality of the heat. To hell with it, I muttered, grabbing a towel. A quick, midnight swim. What could it possibly hurt? I walked down to the small, rickety dock. The water level was the lowest I had seen it, the shore a wide band of slick, dark mud. The air was unnaturally still, the usual chorus of insects silent. I dove in. The water was shockingly, achingly cold. It wasn't the refreshing coolness of a summer lake. It was the profound, timeless cold of a tomb. I swam out toward the center of the reservoir, the cabin's light shrinking behind me. The moonlight was so bright I could see the dark shapes of the mountains around me. It was as I was treading water, catching my breath, that I felt the current. It wasn't pulling me sideways, but downwards. A slow, steady, inexorable tug, as if the lake itself was inhaling. Panic flared in my chest. I started to swim back toward the shore, my strokes frantic. but the shore seemed to be getting farther away. The water level was dropping, and it was dropping fast. Around me, the surface of the water began to churn and boil. And then, I saw it. A dark shape broke the surface 30 feet away from me. It was black, slick with water, and pointed. A roof line, then another, and another. And all around me, the drowned town of Havenwood was rising from its watery grave. The gabled roofs of houses, the sharp, accusing finger of the church steeple, the flat tops of the storefronts along what must have been Main Street. The structures were covered in slime and rotting weeds, but they were horrifically intact. The water cascaded down their sides, and the air filled with the stench of a century of decay and stagnant water. My mind, usually a fortress of logic and code, shattered into a million pieces of raw terror. My feet suddenly hit something hard. I looked down in terror and realized I was standing on the submerged roof of a building. The water was only up to my waist now, and it was draining away with a terrifying sucking sound. I was stranded in the middle of a risen ghost town. My grandfather's warning crashed down on me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a story. This was real. The music I had heard was now clearer, a discordant, watery piano tune coming from a building with a swinging sign that read "The Gilded Cage." The bell I'd heard began to toll from the church steeple, a loud, cracked, demanding sound. And in the black, empty windows of the houses around me, lights began to flicker on. Not electric lights, but the soft, wavering glow of candles and lanterns. Then, from the dark doorways and shattered windows, figures began to emerge. They were pale, waterlogged silhouettes. Their forms were indistinct and wavering, like heat haze on a summer road. Their clothes the tattered fashions of the 1950s. They weren't just pale, they were translucent, their bodies holding the faint, murky light of the deep water from which they had come. They moved slowly, drifting down the resurrected Main Street, their feet not quite touching the ground. They all turned their heads, their featureless faces fixing on the only solid, living, breathing thing in their world. Me. They started to move toward me, drifting over the rooftops and through the muddy, empty streets. They weren't hostile, not yet. They seemed merely curious, drawn to the warmth and the noise of my frantic, panicked heartbeat in their cold, silent world. A small figure detached from the crowd, the ghost of a little girl whose dress was a faded gingham, her hair floating around her head as if still suspended in water. She was holding a waterlogged wooden horse. She looked up at me with wishing, dark eyes and whispered a single word that the water could not wash away. "Welcome."